Last night, the CBC reported that secret Canadian government documents revealed the proposed draft by Minister Prentice, Environment Minister Prentice, to Cabinet, which shows that Canada has no intention of meeting its weak minus 3% target below 1990 levels that was presented in 2007. We are deeply disturbed by the news revealed by the CBC. We think it's unacceptable that one of the richest nations on the face of this planet is not willing to do its fair share when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have one of the worst records of all of the 57 richest nations on the planet, second to last, actually, from just in front of Saudi Arabia. The proposed new legislation is 3 times weaker than what was presented in 2007. In fact, if you compare it to other nations, well, what the CBC revealed yesterday is that this proposal aims for a 10% below business as usual emission reduction by 2020. If we compare with what other nations have announced recently, South Africa has a 34% reduction target below 1990, below business as usual by 2020. Indonesia 26%, Brazil 36 to 39%, Costa Rica carbon neutral by 2021, South Korea 30%. So Canada is here calling on poor nations of the world to do more to fight global warming, while we're secretly planning to do less. I'll stop at that and I'll pass it to Matthew Brownlee. On va faire la deuxième partie en français par la suite.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm just going to very briefly take you through the key themes that emerge from these documents. First of all, for the oil and gas sector, what is outlined in these documents is a proposal that the oil and gas sector as a whole be required to reduce emissions by an amount relative to business as usual levels 3 times less than in the government's Turning the Corner plan, which was released in 2007 and updated in 2008. So this means in terms of megatons, millions of tons of reductions in annual emissions in 2020, that the oil and gas sector would only be reducing by 15 megatons in 2020 below the business as usual level, compared to 48 megatons under the Turning the Corner proposal. And this means that in the new proposal, this proposal from Minister Prentice to Cabinet, the oil and gas sector as a whole would be increasing its emissions by 37% above the 2006 level by 2020, compared to 6% below the 2006 level under Turning the Corner. So Turning the Corner was requiring some very minor reductions in emissions over the 2006-2020 period. We're now seeing a proposal for a massive increase in emissions from the oil and gas sector. And oil sands in particular, the increases are even greater. The 37% is for the whole of oil and gas, including conventional oil, refining, the gas production and transmission industry. For mining and manufacturing facilities, the new proposal also appears to be at least 3 times weaker than Turning the Corner, again in terms of emission reductions in 2020 below business as usual levels. And in fact, these numbers I've just been discussing understate just how weak this proposal is, because firms would be allowed to comply with regulations by making payments into a technology fund instead of actually reducing their emissions. As you may remember, when the government released Turning the Corner, the second version in March 2008, it also published economic analysis that at the time showed that the Turning the Corner proposal itself would fall well short of the government's national emissions target. With this new proposal, 3 times weaker for these 2 key sectors, it becomes clear that the government is planning for an outcome in 2020 which would miss the government's target that it's brought here to Copenhagen by a huge margin. The government is clearly planning to not comply with the target that it's put forward for national emissions in 2020. I will just raise a final theme which has to do with this question of harmonizing with the US. We've heard Minister Prentice make very clear that his policy is to essentially wait for US policy decisions and then to make Canadian policy align with whatever decisions are made in the US on climate change. And in fact, these presentations that the CBC got hold of but in actual fact, they are far weaker than legislative proposals that are currently being developed in the US. I'm just going to turn it over to John Cookett from the Sierra Club to discuss that aspect of the comparison between this proposal and what is in US legislation now being developed.
Hello, everyone. I'll just go over this quite quickly. I think on the big picture, it's very clear the U.S. proposal is from a 2005 baseline. If you've been listening to the U.S. negotiators give their press conferences, I think, in fact, Todd Stern was very emphatic about that point just a minute ago. So as a starting point, obviously, we're in a very different place in the U.S. We're looking at emission reductions from a historical baseline, not business as usual. Then there are these four pieces that are outlined here that are very different from the U.S. We do not have a technology fund in the U.S. We are not giving an option to get out of the cap-and-trade system by buying into some other program. That was never on the table in the U.S., and it's not the way we're going to run our program. The oil and gas sector was never considered to be a trade-exposed industry in the U.S. Although there was lobbying by the refinery industries to put it in there, it has not been done, and we don't expect that it will be going forward. We do not have weaker targets for different sectors. Our entire program puts all sectors under the same cap, treats them all the same way. We have a rebate program for trade-exposed industries, but it does not take them out of the cap-and-trade program, and there's no discussion about doing that. And our program is actually very complicated under how it handles allowances, but there was a decision made at the very beginning by Congressman Waxman and Markey to ensure that there be no windfall profits as a result of the climate bill. And as a result, they did not give credits to any company that would be able to reap windfall profits. So although we don't have 100% auctioning, which is what the president wanted, we do not give credits to companies that could turn around and raise their prices and then pocket the profits as this package would result in. So we took a very different approach on all four of those, and I think they're actually very core elements. And I think it will be very challenging to understand how comparable the packages are because of these key differences, and I think also it would be very difficult to actually harmonize them in the end.
Alors, on va passer en français. Donc, j'ai déjà présenté mes collègues. Je pense que ça va aller pour ce bout-là. Nous avons appris hier, à travers la Société Radio-Canada, qui a obtenu des documents secrets d'une présentation au cabinet d'une nouvelle proposition d'un système de plafonnement à échange du ministre de l'Environnement, Jim Prentice. Les documents, tels que décrits par la Société Radio-Canada, nous troublent énormément, puisque, selon toute évidence, le gouvernement canadien n'a aucune intention d'atteindre son objectif de réduction d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre tel qu'annoncé en 2007. Un objectif, rappelons-le, qui est le plus faible parmi les pays industrialisés, moins 3% sous les niveaux de 1990. Cette nouvelle proposition-là du ministre Prentice, en termes de réduction d'émissions, est 3 fois plus faible que la précédente pour le secteur du pétrole et du gaz. Et donc, on permettrait au secteur du pétrole et du gaz, et notamment les sables bitumineux, d'augmenter leurs émissions de façon substantielle d'ici 2020. Et à titre de comparaison, j'aimerais, donc on parle d'une réduction de 10% sous les niveaux des scénarios usuels jusqu'en 2020. L'Afrique du Sud a adopté un objectif de 34% de réduction sous les scénarios usuels d'ici 2020. L'Indonésie, 26%. Le Brésil, 36 à 39%. Le Costa Rica veut être carboneutre d'ici 2020. Et la Corée du Sud, une réduction de 30%. ce que ce document-là démontre, c'est que le gouvernement un peu ment aux Canadiens, ment aux parlementaires canadiens, ment à la Société des Nations qui réunit ici à Copenhague. Le ministre Prentice demande à des pays en voie de développement d'en faire plus pour réduire leurs émissions de gaz à effet de serre, pendant que nous, en secret, on essaie d'en faire moins. Je m'arrête là, je passe la parole à Matthew Bramley.
Étant donné que le temps file, je pense que je ne vais pas passer à travers les détails plus techniques en grand détail. Je vais juste résumer les 4 thèmes principaux qui ressortent de ces documents-là. Pour l'ensemble du secteur du pétrole et du gaz, la nouvelle proposition révélée dans les documents propose une quantité de réduction d'émissions par rapport au niveau du statu quo 3 fois plus faible que dans le plan fédéral précédent de 2008. Pour les secteurs manufacturiers, miniers également, cette nouvelle proposition semble exiger une quantité de réduction d'émissions, encore une fois, 3 fois plus faible par rapport au niveau du statu quo que dans le plan fédéral précédent. Et lorsqu'on ajoute ces 2 constats, ça devient évident que le gouvernement fédéral n'a pas d'intention d'atteindre son objectif national d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre pour 2020. Les réductions d'émissions qui seraient nécessaires dans le reste de l'économie, à l'extérieur des secteurs industriels, seraient tellement draconiens que c'est clair que le gouvernement n'a pas cette intention-là. Pour conclure, lorsqu'il est question d'harmoniser avec la politique canadienne en matière de climat avec les États-Unis, tel qu'énoncé sur plusieurs tribunes dans les dernières semaines par le ministre Prentice. Et d'ailleurs, ces documents sont présentés comme une proposition d'harmonisation avec les États-Unis. On constate qu'en réalité, il ne s'agit pas d'harmoniser avec la législation américaine qui est en voie d'être élaborée au Congrès, mais plutôt sur plusieurs points d'être notamment plus faible et moins rigoureux que la législation américaine. Et notre collègue peut répondre à des questions, mais je pense qu'on va faire une traduction ou bien répondre aux questions directement en anglais sur cet aspect de comparaison avec les États-Unis. Merci.
Alors, on va prendre vos questions. We can take your questions now. Eric?
You keep referring to this as policy. Eric Reguly, Globe Mail. You keep referring to this as policy. I may be wrong in this. My understanding is that A, these documents are several months old, and B, they were written as, as a discussion idea, not as something that would become actual policy. Now, it may give us insight into where the Canadian government's thinking about treating the oil and gas industry, but is it fair to actually call it policy? Do you have any evidence that this is what's actually going to happen with in the treatment of the oil and gas industry?
These documents were drafts that were very close to finalization of a presentation by the Minister of the Environment to Cabinet. They date from the last few weeks, and they contained words like proposal for decision. They were not completely final presentations, but they were drafts in the very close to the stage of being finalized, and were clearly a request from the Environment Minister for a decision from Cabinet colleagues.
What has happened?
Well, we know that Minister Prentice, of course, committed several times earlier in 2009 to come to Copenhagen with what he called a full suite of policies to address all Canada's major sources of emissions. Evidently, the government took a decision at some point that it did not want to fulfill that commitment, and you'd have to ask the minister why he decided to go back on his word from earlier in the year.
Yes.
Kelly Kratterman, Calgary Herald. I guess then going off Eric's question, isn't the bigger issue here that we do not know for sure what the government's plan is?
I don't think so. John has tried to outline how our proposed legislation has nothing to do with what's on the table in the U.S., but they've said time and again that they were going to adopt all these measures and put forward regulations. But in fact, since they first started talking about this new plan in June 2006 and then announced it in 2007, they've done nothing to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas sector, in terms of putting in place regulations. So I think, I mean, this is yet one of the clear indications that the Conservative government has no intentions of dealing with this issue. Just more delays and more free passes, notably to the oil and gas sector.
If I might add, I think the key significance of this information that's come out is that we have a government of Canada here in Copenhagen that is negotiating on the basis of a target that it clearly does not intend to meet, and that is negotiation in bad faith. And if I was a negotiator from any of the other countries here that Canada is talking to, I would be extremely disturbed and upset. Pardon?
Répétez en français.
Je pense que la signification principale de ces informations, c'est que le Canada vient à Copenhague en mettant sur la table un objectif de réduction d'émissions qu'il n'a clairement pas l'intention de respecter. C'est une négociation de mauvaise foi, et si j'étais un négociateur de n'importe quel autre pays ici, je serais extrêmement consterné par cette approche de la part du Canada.
Yes, Alan? Oh, okay.
I just can't help but notice how similar also these briefing documents and this plan and the talk of it is to the small mini model that Alberta has for its emission reductions. They have intensity targets and they have a technology fund. Is this an Alberta model for the whole country?
The one key difference between what is proposed in these documents and the Alberta regulations is that the caps in the federal proposal would be absolute caps. They would not be intensity targets. But they're absolute caps that are so weak that they give an outcome that looks pretty similar to the kind of outcomes we're getting from the Alberta regulations, which is to say continued emission increases.
An absolute cap on business as usual. So if your emissions continue to grow, then your cap has to increase. And in fact, the document in many places refers to the fact that growth is built into this proposed legislation. Yes, Alice, sorry.
If we were to take the government at its word that it was intending to fulfill the targets that it's bringing to the negotiating table, and they did go ahead with giving that only 10% reduction to the oil and gas industry in Alberta, what would be the effect on the other provinces in Canada? In other words, if that intensity target is applied to oil and gas, what does that mean to the rest of the Canadian economy if the Canadian government were serious about meeting its target?
The emission sources that are the subject of these documents represent a significant proportion of Canadian emissions. The oil and gas industry is about 20% of Canada's emissions. The other heavy manufacturing and mining sectors are about another 15%. So you've got about 1/3 of Canada's emissions that's being given an extremely weak regime. And you can start to do calculations as to, if Canada still has to meet the target the government professes, you start to get into extraordinarily steep emission reductions that you'd have to achieve in sectors like transportation, buildings, agriculture, and in provinces where those sectors take a greater share of emissions. A province like Quebec, where there are essentially no emissions from electricity, lower emissions than elsewhere from industry. Transportation is something like 40% of emissions. And so the implication would be for a province like Quebec, the emission reductions that would be needed to still allow Canada to meet the government's target, they would be extraordinarily deep reductions that are likely not feasible.
If I can add quickly, I mean, if we were in the case like in the U.S. where you have a new administration coming in place, putting in place new measures, legislation, money for renewable energy, cleaner vehicles, home retrofit, then I mean, perhaps it would be possible, but even then, as Matthew pointed out, it would be very, very difficult. But is there anybody in this room who think that the Harper government is in that category of governments, progressive governments, doing everything they can to reduce emissions? I don't think so. Est-ce que, question en français? Monsieur, vous voulez faire ça après? Après? Yes? Alan?
Excuse me. Are you for the next press conference?
Alan Woods from the Toronto Star.
No.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Okay,
From the Sierra
okay,
Club.
good.
It's John Cookett with the Sierra Club.
Thank you. Sorry. Can you, this is more sort of a background just for my information, but the technology fund that is being proposed in Canada, is there any way that you could see that jiving with, with an American cap and trade system? Or would that be out of bounds? How does it work?
It's completely out of bounds. In order to have a comparable system that can link up, they have to both have hard caps. This program blows the cap, and as a result, I think it would be impossible to link the two systems, because in the U.S. you wouldn't be able to buy from the fund. So what you would have is you would have everyone from the U.S. running into the fund to buy credits to escape the cap in the U.S. So to avoid that problem, the only solution is for the U.S. not to link with the Canadian system.
I think it's all the time we have, but
Très rapidement en français, M. Guilbeault. Au fond, vous n'êtes quand même pas certain que ce document-là, d'abord, est si important que ça et que c'est effectivement l'intention du gouvernement fédéral de faire ça. Ils vont nous répondre ça cet après-midi. Non, 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 c'est un vieux document, on ne veut pas faire ça du tout. Vous n'avez pas la preuve que c'est le cas.
en fait, notre compréhension est que ce document-là date de quelques semaines, donc c'est un document récent. C'est un document sur lequel le ministre Prentice s'attendait à avoir une décision faite de la part du cabinet fédéral. Donc, c'est pas un projet là, qui en est à ses balbutiements. Là, on était en fin de parcours d'un nouveau projet de règlement. On était très près d'un projet final. Alors, quand bien même que le fédéral voudrait nier que ça n'a rien à voir avec la réalité, je suis désolé, mais c'est quand même le reflet de l'attitude générale de ce gouvernement-là. On est choqué, on est troublé, mais est-ce qu'on peut vraiment dire qu'on est surpris? Je pense que non. Excusez-moi, on doit sortir, mais nous sommes à votre disposition pour d'autres questions à l'extérieur. Merci beaucoup.